Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Sabinis. I'm the Director of Marketing at Trivella. Today we're hosting a webinar with Forrester and Fox Entertainment on how to kickstart digital transformation with a practical migration strategy. We'll be discussing how Fox Entertainment used Cloud FastPath by Trivella, a fast, simple, secure, and automated cloud migration solution to migrate 28 globally distributed file servers into Box. Joined with me today are Cheryl Mckinnon, Principal Analyst at Forrester, Chris Johnson, IT Director, Asia Pacific at Fox Entertainment, and David Barker, Senior EIS Analyst at Fox Entertainment. Cheryl's going to go through some slides first, so take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, and appreciate the invitation to be a guest speaker on your webinar today. So what we're going to talk about over the next approximately 20-25 minutes is just some of the practical considerations that organizations can think about as they realize that the shift to the cloud is happening for their content management, content collaboration applications, and where to really kind of hone in on some of the practical considerations to make that go as smoothly as possible. So key topics that we're going to take a look at: first off, how to prepare for content services moving into the cloud. We'll talk about some of the challenges that you may face when thinking about a content migration strategy, how to successfully plan for the future, and then we'll turn it over to our guests from Fox. So just start at kind of a very high level. For the last couple of years, Forrester's been talking about what we've been referring to as the age of the customer. And what that means really simply is that we're operating right now in a business climate where the customer really is more empowered than ever before. It means that we have more ability to do our homework, gather knowledge, talk to our social or professional networks, and make a lot of the early stages of a buying decision before we ever engage with a sales rep. And the enterprises, the businesses that recognize this changing power balance, moving into the hands of that customer or citizen or consumer, are the ones that are going to continue to expand their market share and succeed in this fast-paced environment. Now, we've been tracking what we call 5 market imperatives that are really compelling some of the change that we're seeing in both the business and technology landscape responding to this new empowered customer. The first is the requirement, the absolute mission and mandate for organizations to continue to invest to transform that end-to-end customer experience. And this is not just about building out better-looking websites. This is about moving into a much more digital, responsive way of working and making sure that you can serve that customer consistently, whether they come to you through a mobile app, through walking into a storefront, picking up the phone, or engage with you through their website. So that consistent use of data and content to serve that customer more effectively. Second key market imperative is that we're still under the gun to accelerate our move to a much more digital way of working. There's still a lot of manual activities, a lot of clunky Generation 1 systems that we're coping with. And if we're truly going to transform that customer experience, it means we need to move into a much more digital way of working. And we do see the cloud as one of the major enablers here in helping us move to modern platforms to help that data and content get moved, get used and consumed and shared much more effectively. We also need to embrace the mobile mind shift. Increasingly, we're turning to our tablets and phones to make a decision, get that information, refresh our memory on a customer contract before we walk into a meeting. And so the ability to use content proactively from a mobile device is ever more important. And again, we need to take a look at what that means from a modern architecture perspective, because again, many of the on-premises systems that were architected a decade ago are simply not keeping pace with the demands of the mobile enterprise. We also need to make sure that we can take action on the business insights that we have around us. This is how Forrester really sees that next logical step beyond the hype of big data. It means that we actually are looking for opportunities to use analytics, not just to see patterns and trends, but to help us make that next best decision, to take that insight but turn it into a practical action to help us improve our internal operations, improve our goods and services, and again, make sure we're serving our customers in our best ability. And fifth and finally, this is a new imperative that we identified at the beginning of 2016. We see that the opportunity to invest in the security tools that help protect the privacy of your customer information the companies that are taking that seriously will actually emerge as leaders in their own particular markets. We see that companies investing in the security platforms to protect the privacy of their consumer data, of their business partners' intellectual property, making sure that information is trusted and handled appropriately. That's going to be one of the characteristics of market leaders. So driving business growth by respecting privacy and investing in security. So these key five market imperatives are really the levers that we see shifting how organizations are making their technology and business decisions. This particular data chart is coming from some of the very large market surveys that Forrester does year over year. In fact, we surveyed over 18,000 both business and technology decision makers earlier this year to understand, what's really driving enterprises' business decisions. And what's interesting is that when we ask these technology and business decision makers, well, what are those top initiatives that your organization is putting at the top of the to-do list? Interesting that the top one comes up as growing revenue, followed very closely by improving the experience of our customers and then improving products and services. So those three top objectives are really all about getting in tune with the products, the customer needs for those products, and ultimately growing our revenue and market strength because we have that right mix of customers and services. So this is really where customers are looking at investing. What are the right technology tools to help them accomplish these top three goals? Now, if we take all of those kind of top-level market imperatives and trends into account, one of the things that has really been an interesting, although kind of a quiet disruptor in the broader content management and content collaboration market has been this requirement to more actively engage what I started to call the extended enterprise, meaning we need to include our customers, our citizens, partners, suppliers in as active participants in that content co-creation, collaboration, even review and approval cycle. So, that whole traditional definition of the enterprise, meaning, within my company's four walls or just my colleagues who work for my particular branch, we now need to think beyond that and recognize that some of these external parties, like partners, suppliers, customers, are in fact active players in the content creation or process approval lifecycle. And to really make that happen, to really kind of embrace that digital transformation, make this a reality, move away from things like clunky email-based communication habits, it means that we actually need to look at where cloud can be kind of that central hub of content and communication, moving that outside of our data centers into secure cloud services. So when we think about the shift and the ability of cloud to help us fast track some of our move to a digital business, it means we need to start thinking about content migration. And when we think about migrating, the documents, these key corporate assets, there's both business and technology drivers that we need to kind of put on the table. So we are seeing right now that we're in the early days, but that flywheel, that acceleration is happening. Content applications are now starting to move to cloud or software as a service platforms. And I don't see that this pace of shift to cloud is going to let up anytime soon. I think there's still a lot of opportunity here for organizations to make that shift. But it also means that we're thinking about infrastructure modernization, refresh of a lot of the core applications that we rely on, which means that we really must move to a much more modern way of working. We're also seeing that migration is also being promoted or compelled by the desire to rationalize and consolidate systems. So perhaps as a preparation for cloud migration, the first thing we're going to do is consolidate or decommission some of our older on-premises systems, get that information out, dispose of what we no longer need, but understand what's actually worth moving into a fresh new environment. And again, we need to look at systems that are better suited to the increasingly agile deployment methodologies that we see being deployed in the content management collaboration market. This whole need to move faster, get quick wins, be much more iterative, responsive to user requirements is absolutely what we're seeing in this broader content market. Now, we do have some of the dates here to back up some of the comments that I've made about this whole embrace of the extended enterprise as being one of the ongoing disruptors in the content management space. We do every year what we call a panel survey, and these are a series of questions that we send out year over year to decision makers in large enterprises who are in charge of their content management or content collaboration systems. And we ask the question, so are you allowing external users to be part of your content management systems? And well, year over year, there's a solid third or so, in this case 38%, that say no, we don't want those external parties in our content systems. It's interesting that we, year over year, have had approximately a two-thirds response of some form of yes. So 33%, yes, we want contractors, consultants, legal or other service providers to be part of our active content collaboration or even content approval systems. 18%, but yes, perhaps a specific content repository designed just for this particular use case or scenario, with a further 10% yes, allowing customers and partners into their content management applications. So that whole embrace of the extended enterprise is certainly a trend that we're seeing persist. We also asked the follow-up, so well, what do you want to do with these external players that are now coming into your content applications? And 50% wanted to collaborate with the contractors, the agencies, the trusted service providers, perhaps legal or design firms that they worked with on a day-to-day basis. So that trusted ecosystem of, near full-time equivalent types of roles. 31% wanted to actually facilitate secure sharing of customer or citizen information, so statements, forms, other forms of correspondence. And 27% wanted some form of a partner or channel extranet, so a one-stop shop to get approved versions of documents for whether it's product brochures, price lists, or any other kind of documentation that trusted inner circle actually needs. So a lot of really interesting scenarios in terms of engaging with that extended enterprise, that external. If we take a look at now, what are some of the challenges as we think about moving to this world of on-premises to cloud to take advantage of some of these modern collaborative platforms, some of these modern approaches to mobile content work. We do know that migration is a necessity for most organizations. If you work in a regulated industry, you may need to keep some of that older content for specific legal or regulatory purposes. So organizations that have a retention policy certainly need to abide by that as part of a migration effort, understanding what needs to be kept perhaps for 7 years, or because there's a legal hold, making sure that nothing is altered or deleted as part of that process, which may have negative implications down the road. Other organizations, especially if it's rich in intellectual property or research and development, corporate memory is preserved in a lot of these content artifacts, the documents, the knowledge output of whether it's the researchers, engineers, architects. This is information that needs to be preserved and captured and taken care of over the long period of time. And of course, we need to make sure that we're protecting customer, partner, supplier communication, contracts, agreements, joint venture information. This is obviously ongoing, essential to ongoing relationships, as well as the routine flow of our business. But not everything needs to be migrated. This is one area where organizations, as part of preparing for a move to a cloud content platform or a modern system, often neglect the effort and realize that we don't have to move everything. We can make some informed decisions about what to keep and what can safely be disposed of or perhaps archived to a nearline location. So when we think about not everything that needs to be migrated, information that is very infrequently used, so items that haven't been touched in 3 years or 5 years, there may be some business value or economic value in simply leaving it in place. Leave it in that legacy repository to live out its natural retention schedule or scheduled lifespan. Also, you could consider delivering access to those older systems via some kind of integration, federated search, so kind of just access it on that, once a year as required versus moving it to your new clean system. And this allows architects and the technical roles, the business roles as well, who can choose to then focus all of the deployment or the new system adoption resources, whether it's time or whether it's money, on more of that day forward scenario. So let's not, take 6 months to go through this whole migration effort if only a small amount of the content is actually useful going forward. Let's make some informed decisions here. So we do see that there's medical and business issues when we think about the migration. We talked about some of the technical challenges, but some of the business challenges are also potential barriers. So do we have ownership of the content, both the documents, but even some of the older systems? If we have a legacy contract management application and that team has been disbanded for 2 years, for example, the ownership of that information may actually be unclear. We don't know who's the steward of that data, or who can we go to make an informed decision about migration. So that knowledge of the data may be incomplete, and this is a potential barrier. We also see that where there's a lot of complex integrations or customizations of older on-premises systems, it can make it hard to migrate to newer systems just because of the dependencies. So if I move something, I may be breaking something in a workflow downstream. Also, just any kind of new system adoption does require change management, the planning, the training, potentially re-engineering some of the standard practices or business processes. And we do recognize that some of the risk-adverse roles inside our organizations, often perhaps in a records or retention management type of role, may not yet be fully comfortable with cloud services. So getting over that adoption concern, making sure that everyone is comfortable, that you've asked all the right security questions when it comes to cloud service adoption, making sure that that change management education is done is also something that needs to be done before full migration efforts. What's really interesting, when we survey the decision makers in our content management readership base, we ask the question, so what are the big challenges facing your content programs today? And really interesting that it's this whole wild west of the proliferation of file shares or ungoverned SharePoint sites that really are the concern of content management decision makers today. So this is a persistent concern in organizations. We've got a lot of content out there. A lot of it is not in our control. So perhaps we have that opportunity here with migration to really get control around it and move confidently to a new modern cloud platform. Very closely related to the first concern is the second. So 43% of our respondents said that they're also concerned about a lack of coordinated governance. And this goes back to getting the business, the technical, and the compliance decision makers at the table to make informed decisions about how do we go forward? How do we make determinations about what to keep and what to move? So a lot of really interesting challenges with that whole sprawl and disorganization of our legacy data stores are certainly at the top of the list. But we do find that influencers, and I mentioned earlier some of the risk-adverse roles that many of us have inside our organizations, are still learning to ask the right questions as they consider moving to cloud services for content or records management scenarios. This is actually a data point that comes from our joint survey with the Industry Association ARMA, a nonprofit association representing information management professionals. And when we surveyed their member base last year, we asked the question, so what would be an inhibitor behind moving to a SaaS or hosted content or records management system? And it's interesting that 42% said it was the potential of privacy or security concerns, versus the real concerns, 19%, of specific laws or policies that prevent using this approach. So there still is an opportunity, I would say, for those of you, in the industry from a vendor perspective, educate those more risk-averse roles around how to ask the right security questions so that they have that comfort level of moving to a cloud service for their content. So we've talked about some challenges. Let's talk now about planning for the future and thinking about how to have this outcome. So just from a broader market trend perspective, we again surveyed, this is coming from our survey of some of the software technology decision makers earlier this year. We asked the questions around using software as a service for applications like content management. And we see approximately 18% have already mostly or predominantly replaced their on-premises systems with software as a service. But there's still a really interesting tipping point coming in about 2 years from now. So that 2018 timeframe is where we're going to start to see a lot of the heat in terms of content services in the cloud. So 27% plan to replace most or all of their existing on-premises systems with SaaS within 2 years. Another 23% are already using SaaS to complement their existing on-premises systems, and again, 12% planning to complement software as a service with their on-premises systems within about 2 years. So again, between the 27% in terms of mostly replace and the 12% complement, that's kind of where the interesting tipping point is going to happen from a content management perspective. So going back for success, we did a research note on migration strategies about 2 years ago, and some of the findings as part of our customer interviews continue to hold very true today. There really is a two-sided effort. You know, we can't put the onus of migration just on the technical roles and teams that we have at our disposal. We really do have to make sure that we've got some business stakeholder perspective here as well, because the business stakeholders ultimately know what the content is about. You know, what do we do with those documents? Why are we keeping them? You know, making informed decisions about what do we move, what do we keep, or what is safe to dispose of based on our internal records management policies. It's also a very good time to review or update some of the business rules. So if it's a time to streamline or consolidate or modernize some of our security policies or retention policies, great time to do that as we shift into more modern agile platforms in a cloud scenario. And, you know, to make sure that these are the teams that are leading the change management charge and understanding, you know, how is adoption of cloud for content and mobile services going to be improving our business practices, but making sure that the comfort level is built up. The technology management roles, of course, are on the hook for the fundamentals, the nuts and bolts of the migration effort, you know, extracting and transforming that content and related data, and then ultimately migrating that content and data to the target cloud repository. Jointly, the two teams need to work together to set business goals for the migration project. You know, what are the priorities? What's the information that we need to start with, so we have an active set of, you know, projects, an active set of programs that we can hit the ground running as we adopt these new tools. Make sure we've got the right seed information there so we're productive from day one. Jointly set success metrics. So what does success look like in 6 weeks, 6 months, 12 months? Discover and assess that content and data together. Again, make the priority decisions about what to move and when. And then, of course, to test and verify to make sure everything has moved over as expected. There's no unexpected security issues. Information is easy to find, and we can move forward from there. Now, when we talk about a migration strategy, it really does have to align with what is our broader vision for how we handle our enterprise's content. When we think about setting success measurements, the first thing we recommend our customers do is really to set out the key aspects of the current state. So where are you today? You know, what are you doing in terms of serving your customer experience, your employee engagement, your information governance, and of course your technology investments. So have that documented visibility into what your goals and also the opportunities are in terms of business improvement. The second element that we have companies really outline or articulate as part of setting success measurements is just to assess their internal organizational culture. What is their tolerance for change? What are some of the common attributes that, you know, perhaps their peer organizations have with similar patterns or scenarios? Plan and prioritize some of the use cases based on similarities of what peer organizations are doing. And focus in on those areas where, you know, there's opportunities to improve business process or, you know, get some additional productivity or customer experience wins out of better knowledge sharing. The third and final element of that strategy then is to, you know, hone in on those real opportunities of improvement. So, you know, where can you break down some of the silos imposed by technology or culture? You know, where can cloud services help you disassemble or decommission some of those silo-based on-premises systems and facilitate easier file sharing, for example? So when we think about you know, the joint activities that the technology and business teams must plan together, first off, ask those tough questions. What exactly must be migrated? What's a must-have and what's a nice-to-have? Set priorities accordingly so that as these cloud services come on board for content management, collaboration, file sharing with your key stakeholders, both internal and external. We know that we have the right information in place to get the ball rolling. Set those priorities. Establish ownership and requirements. So if there's particular project areas where there's no clear ownership because they've been decommissioned or because it's inactive, make sure that we're making informed decisions about who moves that project or program forward. And if there is no clear ownership and there is no benefit about migrating it, think about some kind of migration or other kinds of preservation efforts instead. Think about what those requirements are to preserve the older content. Is it there for legal purposes, regulatory purposes, corporate memory purposes? And make sure that if it is going to be moved or migrate, you're paying attention to things like digital preservation, knowing that we can actually retrieve that in 7 or 10 years. Create a plan to minimize the disruption and confusion. There are, different technology approaches where, we can do periodic migrations or in-place migrations so that we don't need to do that big bang necessarily overnight. We can do things more piecemeal based on teams that come on board or as they're trained and receive their orientation. And of course, draw that picture of success, including, what are the measurements so that you can demonstrate, as you go for additional funding or get approval for continued rollout that, yes, we've met our business objectives, and there are some measurable either top line, bottom line gains that can actually be demonstrated to the management. Metrics, again, not unique necessarily just to migration efforts, but when you think about your content management strategies overall, think about the benefits around user productivity. So how are we cutting back on the time that we take to serve a customer or to complete a program or a project? So that whole productivity area is one that you might be able to start measuring in terms of the reduction of time to conduct a particular transaction, or the requirement to not have to redo work because information is easier to find and at your disposal. Understand if there's any specific revenue opportunity benefits. So can you actually measure a faster close of a customer deal because you're able to fast track some of the engagement and get them to buy into your product and service much more quickly, get products to the shelves much more quickly? Can you measure things like customer satisfaction? So being able to serve them more accurately in the channel, mobile versus web versus in person that they prefer. Where does that play a role? The better use of capital in terms of making investments. So can you decommission some expensive on-premises systems and the storage that goes with it as part of a migration to a cloud service? Can you better protect your assets? So if you have compliance obligations, you want to make sure that you're not losing or risking the breach of sensitive information. By having an easy-to-use, mobile-friendly cloud experience, does that mean you're cutting back on insecure USB drive exchange when we need to move batches of files from person to person? And then, of course, can we measure some benefits around compliance? Does this make it easier for you to make sure that you're meeting the obligations to your regulators, to your auditors, whatever other kinds of policies that you may have to be concerned about? So with that, I'll now turn it over to our second guest at Fox.
Thanks, Cheryl. Chris Johnson speaking. So Fox has been on an interesting journey. If we look at our organisation, and I'll talk specifically today around Fox Filmed Entertainment, which was the group that I'm a part of, we're effectively in the business of creating content to entertain audiences all over the planet, whether that's in a format for television or whether that's in a format for cinema. And for us, the idea of collaborating as a business is absolutely critical and essential as we release content, as we work through marketing plans, and we try to gain excitement and generate interest for that particular product or piece of content. But we're also sitting squarely in that band, as Cheryl outlined, of organisations who actually invite external parties into our collaboration platforms. That's essential for us in the distribution of our content, but it's also essential that we maintain security around that particular content. And to that end, there are many systems within our complex organisation, but one of the ones that I guess we've looked at in the last 12 months with a lot more focus is actually in the cloud space for general file management and distribution. And for us, we settled on a product called Box, which has a particularly good brand and for us is proving extremely successful. And the motivation for us was really driven by this geographical distribution for us as an organisation. We rely heavily, as I mentioned, on our people effectively, I guess, and efficiently collaborating as we create and distribute that content. And the need for collaboration being external meant that we had to lessen the need on IT resources, setting up FTP servers, for example, or constantly changing permissions on file structures and directories, or, as Cheryl mentioned, heavily reliant on email as a transport mechanism to send content around. And of course, once the email's left your inbox, you don't know who has chosen to forward that email on. So implementing a cloud-based storage platform for us made a lot of sense. Whilst we were driven by a heavy desire to increase our capacity and effectiveness in collaboration, we were also somewhat driven by a desire to improve our security around content distribution. And we've been moving towards, over a period of time, what we call our zero footprint initiative, which is to reduce the volume of infrastructure in premises around the world. So we targeted, outside of North America, we targeted 27 cities around the world with 28 file servers, physical file servers running your classic Active Directory style file sharing. And looking at that data, it summed in excess of 50 terabytes of information that wasn't the actual core assets that we distribute to cinema or into a digital medium, but was all of the supporting material around planning for that release, storyboarding, some of the ideas and what have you for how we would release that content. How did we take that information and put it into a format that would allow our people to better collaborate was where Box came in. And we made the decision to actually centralize the leadership of this particular migration, rather than attempting to do this in 3 major super geographies, that's EMEA, APAC, and Latin America. We coordinated that effort out of Asia Pac in this particular instance, but using resources from across the globe. And one of the resources joining me today, David Barker, actually headed that migration for us at a technical level out of London, and it worked particularly well. We'll talk a little bit about the technology stack in a moment that we used from our friends at Tavella. But ultimately for us, the motivation was not only to increase collaboration, not only to further secure our content and provide an easier means of, sharing content with external parties in a secure manner, but also to try to help IT move higher up the value chain within the organization. We weren't gaining any real credibility within the organization, spending so much time administering infrastructure and simply modifying, changing and managing file taxonomies and acres and acres and acres of files that were aging and not necessarily top of mind for people, certainly from a taxonomy creation perspective or metadata tagging perspective. And we also wanted to move our business users, as of course IT moved higher up the value chain, into a position of greater self-help, where they were less reliant on us and more reliant, frankly, on their own understanding of the technology without a fear of the use of the technology and an ability to collaborate. So that's where Box came in, and the migration was very structured and planned. We certainly looked at the age of the content. We certainly looked at the level of duplication in content creation, the degree to which that data was tagged and how that would work in a cloud model, shifting from a file server-based approach to a cloud model, of course, gave us the opportunity to leverage the power of search, particularly across multiple territories, which we just didn't have in the siloed file server approach. So a lot of planning went in, and I think perhaps one of the reasons we were so successful with this migration to this new platform was we never looked at it as a technical exercise. We looked at it as a fairly major exercise in change management. And we took a business adoption model, appointing business champions very early on with a consistent message and almost vision, if you will, of the end game, as opposed to tackling this as a technical project that if we built it, hopefully people would engage. With that approach, we actually self-empowered, if you like, the users. Our data sat into 2 major categories: almost the personal file share approach, where you would have your own network drive and your own content on that you weren't really in a position to share with anyone else traditionally through any means other than email. because the permissions around that content were locked down to you as an individual user. And then there was the shared drive approach, which many organizations have, and Fox certainly had, where the file server in the given local office had at times highly complex folder permissions set up for certain business units or more broader general drives. And looking at those two classifications of content, we empowered our users with Box and just the out-of-the-box interfaces that you get with a product such as Box to bring their own content up into the cloud. We started with their own personal shared drive, personal network drive content up into Box, and that allowed them to whet their appetite, so to speak, to get a sense for how they could use the platform to interact with their own files. What quickly became apparent was that they were all of a sudden released from the shackles of folder permissions and the like within a file server, and they began to actually share their own personal content with their peers and colleagues, and we were rapidly moving into a shared approach through a cloud supplier, as opposed to the very fixed approach that they'd been in a matter of days, weeks beforehand. The personal content that they were moving themselves up into the cloud was nowhere near the volume that we had remaining on these servers around the planet for the shared content. So it was at that point we began the exercise of IT actually moving that content up, just using the out-of-the-box products, web browsers and what have you up into Box. And we quickly gained a sense of frustration just with the time that was going to take, with the lack of error handling, exception handling, etc. The complexity around permissions, mapping, folders that may have been owned by certain groups that the business had outlined they no longer wanted necessarily to restrict to only those groups. So we're in a world of trying to manually map permissions, etc., between a cloud and a file server. And it was at that point that we went to market and decided to have a look, actually working with Box in the first instance for the introduction, but having a look to see if there was a smarter way in which we could shift these massive volumes of content from so many geographically distributed cities up into the cloud without necessarily having to do this in situ in each location, and with a greater sense of accomplishment throughout it. A project of this size naturally had many stakeholders, and the ability for me ultimately leading this project to be able to report that progress was key. And I'm pleased to say we quickly found an organisation called Tavella, and in no time at all worked through almost a paper-based evaluation of their technology. And I have to say the willingness to share their success and help us understand their story with no obligation whatsoever was one of the most, I guess, inviting aspects of dealing with Tavella in the early days. We were quickly into a proof of concept. We set up different distribution points or aggregation points, if you like, from around the planet, in South America, in Asia Pacific and in Europe, to try to test the smarts of this particular platform. And what was said on paper, we were quickly able to demonstrate in reality. And before I hand over to David to talk about the way in which we actually attacked that data, I'll just share quickly some of the killer features that Fox certainly used that in hindsight, when we look back at the manual approach of moving content into Box or any other cloud platform, I'm really just not sure how we got by until we implemented Tavella. But really for me, it was fundamentally the ability to be able to automate. To be able to use the full 24 hours in a day without necessarily having people work through the clock, to be able to pre-queue, if you like, these particular content migrations by city, by folder, to whatever granular level you wanted into the Box cloud. The ability to be able to do what we call a dry run, where you can effectively test the migration from a particular source of folders with a set permission in place into, in our case, Box, and almost run a scenario whereby Tavella, Cloud FastPath, the platform, will tell you in almost a what-if analysis whether that will or won't be successful, whether you will break permissions, whether there are file names in the particular source directories that you're attempting to move up into your cloud provider are not compliant from a special characters perspective, and we had plenty of those in the early days. The ability to be able to map permissions So you may have a folder structure owned in your source target rather into your destination that is just not applicable anymore. It may have been owned by a group that has disbanded as part of the migration, or it may be owned by an individual who's left the organization. Box's permissions are different to Active Directory, so you don't actually have the ability within the Box cloud to have nested folder structure permissions in the same way that you do in a Windows file server in this instance. So you've got to be able to think about that in advance, because you can unintentionally move a whole heap of content up from Active Directory into a cloud provider and unintentionally grant access to a nested group of users that is just not the same as your ability to be able to lock it down on the source file server. Cloud FastPath handles that very well. It will actually tell you in advance, part of this dry run, as to what's actually going to break, and you can use some configuration files as part of the particular migration to then remap those on the fly. Saved us hours and hours and hours of work. Hierarchical permission structures I've talked about, but I guess the other feature for us is optimized data transfer. You know, we were trying to shift content from cities with extremely low bandwidth in Latin America and in some of our locations across Asia, where optimization was key. And it's not uncommon in lower bandwidth situations for you to actually lose internet during a big migration. And sadly, there's no tolerance when you're using just a cloud storage provided web interface. If that transfer fails midway through, then you know, you're in a really awkward position attempting to work out which files did go up, which files didn't go up, did they part send, how do you stand that up again? And the Cloud FastPath technology takes care of all of that for you. It has a highly detailed audit log that allows you at any point in time to resume a failed transfer. And the other one that I think I want to label as the killer feature, certainly for Fox, was this concept of being able to remove downtime for your given users through this iterative transfer concept. So we would actually take a weekend traditionally to try to move a whole heap of folders, and prior to the beginning of that weekend you would email your users and say, hey everybody, stop work at 5 p.m. on a Friday night. Hopefully the transfers will finish by Monday morning, and you know, we'll let you know when you're allowed to access your files again. We would do that weekend after weekend after weekend in a traditional move, but with the Cloud FastPath product we were actually able to migrate content whilst it was being accessed by users. And the way that simply works is it takes the file, it moves it up into the destination, and then you can iterate through night after night looking for any files that have changed since the first time that you started shifting the content, and it would only move the delta. So that by the third, fourth, fifth night after a weekend, all of the data had gone up, and the little tweaks and changes that happen throughout each day, you would merely need to say, tonight at 10 p.m, don't access any files for 2 hours, 1 hour, whatever it might be, and the final few files would go up into the destination and we could shut down all access to the original file servers. That saved our bacon, so to speak. That was the killer feature for us that basically put us into a position where this looked seamless to our users. And for us, in an organization such as our IT group that constantly wants to add value, wants to look as shiny as possible in the eyes of our business, removing friction from their day and, you know, adding value to their day, that was really where this came in on its own. We simply couldn't have done it without that feature. David, would you perhaps like to share a little bit more around the mechanics, the way in which we queued data and the way in which we transferred that? Because I think it was quite unique in the sense that this master console, if you will, was driven by one human, that being David Barker, for whole of planet. Over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Getting up and running with Cloud FastPath is a pretty straightforward affair. It can be installed on either servers or workstations running a Windows OS, from Windows 7 up to Server 2012. We opted to install our client software on workstations based in locations that have the best internet bandwidth and latency to develop hops. The client can be downloaded by logging into your Cloud FastPath control panel. It's then just a case of following the on-screen prompts to install. Once the software is installed, the client needs to be registered to your Cloud FastPath instance. This is done by entering your credentials for the control panel. Once the client's registered, it appears as a source in your control panel. You can then add shares from your servers or a local drive as a new system for that client. The Cloud FastPath text will automatically deploy your destination POPs, leaving you to add credentials for the destination. In our case, we were transferring to Box. All we had to do was select the POP, create a new system, select Box as the system type, and enter credentials that had access to the folders in Box we wish to use. Once you have your source and destination locations set up, it's time to create a transfer job. This is easily done from the control panel. You press the Create a New Job button, give the job a name, select the source machine from your list, and select the files you wish to transfer. Once that's done, you select the destination location from your pre-configured POP list and confirm where your files will end up. As we were migrating data from multiple locations at the same time, we created a naming convention for our jobs, which included the group of people that were the data owners, the location, the destination URL. This helped greatly when it came time to scheduling jobs and informing the users of the progress. After completing these tasks, it's just a simple case of pressing Run to start your data transfer. As Chris mentioned, there are some very nifty features within Cloud FastPath. The simulation option we used extensively to generate a report of the files, their permissions, and any issues that might arise when transferring them to Box. This allowed us to mitigate those issues before doing the actual data transfer. Scheduling jobs can be done by selecting the Schedule tab for a particular job. You can then choose to start a job at a specific time and date, or once a previous job is completed. This is a great feature to allow you to keep a POP transferring data for long periods of time without manual intervention. Synchronizing files is automatic. You just need to rerun your job either manually or using a schedule. This means you can run the job as many times as you want to keep your data in sync. You can even set the synchronization option to delete files, but caution with this, and a simulation beforehand is prudent with the option selected. All in all, Cloud FastPath was a great asset in migrating the 50 terabytes of data we had to Box.
Great. Thank you, David and Chris. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to find out more, please visit cloudfastpath.com. Sign up for a free trial. We encourage you to try it out.